Hello. In this video, we're going to be talking about deductive arguments from Elliott Sober's book, Core Questions in Philosophy. This is pages 7 through 19 of the reading, or it's also the PDF that I posted. Okay. In philosophy, what we're doing is constructing and evaluating arguments. Now, when we use the word argument, we don't mean what we normally mean in regular conversation. We don't just simply mean a disagreement, right? Instead, when we use the word argument, what we mean is reasons for a conclusion. And I'm going to say this over and over again throughout this presentation. In philosophy, an argument is the reasons for a conclusion. Okay? And we often spend a lot of time in philosophy carefully thinking about the things that we may normally take for granted. So we're going to start the class by thinking about whether or not God exists and how it is we can know that. Certainly, it's something that some people take for granted, others maybe not. When we move on to Descartes, we're going to be looking into questions like, how do I know that the piece of paper in front of me really exists? How do I know that any of this is real? And then when we move on to truth, we're going to be thinking about how is it that we can know when something is true or not? What conditions bring about truth? I think all kinds of questions that normally in your everyday life you don't spend too much time thinking about. All right. Now, arguments are divided into two parts, premises and conclusions. Okay? Now, both premises and conclusions are statements that are expressed using a declarative statement. Okay? A declarative statement is a statement that declares or states something. Thanks, Dr. Nash, that doesn't really help me. However, trying to figure out exactly what a declarative statement is actually easier if you look at what a declarative statement isn't. So a declarative statement isn't a question or a command or a statement of emotion, okay? So a statement that declares or states something is what can be a premise or a conclusion, not questions, commands, or statements of emotion, okay? And premises and conclusions also need to be the kinds of statements that can be either true or false. And again, premises are the reasons for your conclusion. All right. So, two questions that we want to ask ourselves when we are evaluating arguments are the premises plausible? And if the premises are true, do they give us a good reason to believe the conclusion? Now, in addition, a good argument is rationally persuasive. A rationally persuasive argument gives you good reason to think that the conclusion is true. Now, we may wonder, is being rationally persuasive the same as simply being persuasive? Well, I don't think that it necessarily is, because people sometimes use arguments that trick people into believing what they say, right? Not because their reasons are good, but instead because they use some sort of technique to convince people that their reasons are good. All right. So an argument can be persuasive while not being rationally persuasive. Okay. So these types of arguments may convince people, but not for good reasons. They're persuasive, but not rationally persuasive. A rationally persuasive argument is an argument that has good reasons and the right form. Okay. The right form. A good argument doesn't only have true premises, it also has the right form. So, here's an argument. Grass is green, so roses are red. This is a weird one. Notice that although both premises are true, generally speaking, grass is green, right, and roses are red, however, the premise that grass is green is irrelevant to the conclusion that roses are red. A good argument doesn't only need two true premises, the premises also have to be related to each other and to the conclusion in the right kind of way. All right. Now we're going to move on to deductive arguments. That was sort of an overview of arguments more generally. Now we're going to look at a subset of arguments known as deductive arguments. A deductively valid argument is an argument that has the following property. If its premises were true, its conclusion would have to be true. Okay? So a deductively valid argument is an argument where if the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true. Now, a sort of a wrench that can be thrown in here is that a valid argument need not have true premises. But I'll talk about this a little bit more soon. Now, this word valid, notice that valid is a technical term when it's used by philosophers. So I'm going to ask you now to think about how it is that you use the word valid in your daily talking. In everyday language, we often use the word valid to mean something like good or right when talking about arguments or reasons, okay? So I might say, your reason is valid when I mean something like, that's a good reason, or I agree with you, all right? However, as I said just a moment ago, for philosophers, valid is a technical term. Validity is a property of an argument, and a valid argument is an argument where if the premises were true, its conclusion would have to be true. So to say that an argument is valid means that the argument has this quality of if its premises are true, its conclusion would have to be true. So to give you a little bit better idea how this works, we're going to look at a couple of valid arguments. All fish swim, all sharks are fish, so all sharks swim. Okay? So we can see how the conclusion, all sharks swim, follow from the two premises. Here's another one. All particles have mass, all electrons are particles, so all electrons have mass. So we can see how the conclusion follows from the premises. We can also see that if the premises are true, because of the relationship between the premises and the conclusion has to be true. So notice that with a deductively valid argument, it's all about the logical form. So this is what's happening in those arguments. All B's are C's, all A's are B's, so all A's are C's. Okay? So we can see better when we look at it in this form that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. It just follows from the form of the argument. All B's are C's, all A's are B's, so all A's are C's. As long as an argument has this form, it's deductively valid, and as we will see, it doesn't matter what the premises are. So this can be a little bit weird. But to look at the form again in one of the previous arguments we just looked at, all fish swim, all B's are C's, all sharks are fish, so all A's are B's, so all sharks swim, where all A's are C's. However, as I've said, an argument can be valid even if the statements it contains are wildly implausible. So remember that validity which is the property of being valid, is about an argument's form, not its content. Okay? A valid argument can have false premises and a false conclusion, yet it can still have the right form. So here's an example of what that might look like. All plants have minds. All ladders are plants, so all ladders have minds. Notice that this is a valid argument, right? It has the form, all B's are C's, all A's are B's, so all A's are C's. All right? All plants have minds, all B's are C's, all ladders are plants, all A's are B's, so all ladders have minds, right? But each of the premises is basically gibberish, and the conclusion has to obviously be false. But that doesn't mean that the argument can't be valid. Okay, So we may wonder, what's so sweet about validity? Well, notice one thing that is great about a valid argument is that if your premises are true, the conclusion has to be true, right? That's why these arguments are so powerful, and we'll talk about this more soon. All right. However, let's look at an invalid argument, so an argument that doesn't have the right form. Emeralds are green, roses are red, so lemons are yellow. This is a weird one, kind of like our fish and ladder and brain argument we just were looking at. But notice that the premises are all true, and the conclusion is true, but the premises and the conclusion don't fit together in the right way. So when we look at this, we can start to see that what the point of validity is in an argument is that it has the right form, that the premises fit together with each other and the conclusion in such a way that the argument makes sense. Whereas this invalid argument, emeralds are green, roses are red, so lemons are yellow, right? Even though each premise and the conclusion are true, it doesn't make any sense. It's not valid. It's basically just three unrelated points. Okay. Now here's another kind of invalid argument, but this one's invalid in a different way. If Jones stands in the heavy rain without an umbrella, then Jones will get wet. Jones is wet, so Jones was standing in the heavy rain without an umbrella. Okay, now this may seem like good reasoning, right? But what's really going on here? We have to ask ourselves, what is going on? So notice that this argument has a different form. It has this form. If P, then Q, Q, so P. But notice that this isn't a valid way of arguing. This, in fact, is the logical fallacy affirming the consequent. Let's look at another one. If Sam lives in Wisconsin, then Sam lives in the USA. Sam lives in the USA, so Sam lives in Wisconsin, right? Another example of what's called affirming the consequent, right? It doesn't follow that because Sam lives in the USA, that he must live in Wisconsin, right? If Sam lives in the USA, he could live anywhere. Similarly with the previous argument, right? If Jones stands in the heavy rain without an umbrella, then Jones will get wet. Jones is wet, but notice that there could be a whole bunch of different reasons why Jones is wet that has nothing to do with standing in a heavy rain without an umbrella. Okay. So again, the form of this invalid argument, if P then Q, Q, so P. This is an argument that doesn't work. It's a logical fallacy called affirming the consequent, and it's something to watch out for in your reasoning, something that I think we can all fall into pretty easily. All right. Begging the question. How's the phrase begs the question used in popular discourse? That begs the question, at least in my experience, is often used to mean something like, that raises the question, right? So maybe the fact that Dr. Nash talks about McDonald's so much begs the question of if he ever goes anywhere else to eat, right? So here when we use the phrase begs the question, we mean something like raises the question, okay? Now, this misuse of begs the question makes philosophers' skin crawl, okay? So really, what begging the question means is that when an argument begs the question, the premises assume the truth of the conclusion, all right? Now, begging the question is a type of circular reasoning. A circular argument is an argument where the conclusion of the argument is also used as one of the argument's premises. So the most basic form of a circular argument is something like this. Lemons are yellow, so lemons are yellow. So this argument obviously has no content, right? It is just the premise followed by the conclusion, which is exactly the same as the premise. But it gives us the form of a circular argument. Now, here's another circular argument. The Bible says that God exists, so God exists, right? Notice, we can ask ourselves, is this argument convincing if you don't already think that God exists when you read the Bible that says that God exists? So this is a classic version of a circular argument. Now I will pause here that there are all kinds of perfectly non-circular ways that you can use the Bible in your arguments, right? But notice that this version is circular. Okay, another non-religious version of a circular argument. Consumer Reports ranked itself very highly in an article evaluating the reliability of consumer magazines. So Consumer Reports is reliable. Is this argument convincing if you're skeptical at all of Consumer Reports? Right? Notice what they're doing is they're ranking themselves highly in an article evaluating the reliability of consumer magazines. And so from this, we deduce that they're reliable, right? We're just using the conclusion in our premise. Okay. To review, a few questions that I'm going to ask. What does it mean to say that an argument is deductively valid? Give an example of a valid argument that has false premises and a true conclusion. Give an example of an invalid argument that has true premises and a true conclusion. What does it mean to say that an argument is circular or that it begs the question? Give an example of an argument of this type different from the arguments presented in this chapter. All right. Thanks a lot, and have a good day.